So, well, wonderful to be here, and as Chris was saying, it's great to come home. It's been a while since we've had one of these events, and I always enjoy them. It's great to see so many familiar faces out here, and really happy to be talking with Jeffrey on this particular topic. So, as Adam was saying, it's been a while since ODI was created. Gone through a name change. Started out as the Office of Digital Innovation, now Office of Data and Innovation. Started in 2019, and very much at the time that we were putting this together, was put together as an organization to do change, really as a change agent for the state, and kind of in the mold of USDS 18F, the innovation office that we'd created at the California Health and Human Services Agency. And so you came on shortly thereafter. You're one of the first that we brought in, and have held several roles in the organization. So maybe talk a little bit about the roles that you've had at ODI as it's gone through its changes, and kind of what you've seen there.
Sure, thanks, Mike. And I think there's a theme happening today because technically Mike was my first boss when I started. Really as a volunteer. And so I came on, and I believe it was April of 2020, volunteering for, at that time, it was a collaborative group called the Data and Insights Working Group, which ODI played a very large part in. And the goal of that group was to provide actionable insights to the governor's office to drive policy decisions and to better deliver services. And so we were really focused at that time on measuring the effect and the adoption of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the NPIs, and we did a lot of really cool stuff with Department of Transportation data, and we're able to measure how often folks were traveling, whether or not folks were abiding by the stay-at-home order. Likewise, with the Get Out the Vaccine campaign, we were very focused on gathering customer data, gathering resident data, so we could better target the equitable delivery of the vaccine. And so my introduction to working in GovOps in the Office of, at that time, Digital Innovation, was always very focused on we need to understand Californians and understand what they need in order to effectively serve them. And of course, at that time, it was a matter of life and death. And so after that, we were able to bring those sort of best practices and principles into what started to feel maybe a little bit more normal, our day jobs. And I was appointed the Deputy Director for Service Innovation a few years ago. That was under Secretary Tong's leadership at that time, my other boss. And so what that meant was, and part of the structure of ODI includes a great deal of technologists on the staff. So we have full stack engineers, user experience designers, content designers, user researchers. And so I led that team, and we brought a lot of those same principles about building tools and processes to understand Californians, use that data to design new services and improve the way we deliver those services. Since then, a lot of that work is project-based, right? So we work directly with departments. Some of you are in this room. And the operating model there is to partner with the department, do problem definition, find out how we can come up with an innovative solution, and then the next step, once we prove the value, once we have a proof of concept, is to figure out how does that scale? Because it's great to fix one problem with an innovative solution at a department, but we're really focused on statewide transformation. And so today, I'm now in the role of Chief Strategist, and my team is here. My whole team, I think, is here. Thank you guys for showing up and supporting us. And really what that role is focused on is just that, is that scaling aspect. So recognizing that in order to be effective in that larger goal of government transformation, we need to train state staff. So the training team is part of the strategy team. On the strategy team, we have a head of government affairs. Our private sector partners here have heads of government affairs, but you usually don't hear about those kinds of roles within state government. We need a role like that on our team because our partners are other state departments. They are our customers. And so now we're focused on taking those key learnings that we get at the project level and figuring out how we can scale them statewide.
All right. You brought up during the pandemic and literally matter of life and death. And in so many instances, I saw California was at the front because of the work that we'd done before the pandemic. All of the things that we'd put in place that we were then able to scale very quickly, or that we were able to come up with a derivative use for. You talk a little bit about the challenges and some of the successes of ODI during the pandemic and since.
Sure. I mean, in order to do the work of customer listening, integrating that into product development and product improvement, we had to stand up some tools and services pretty quickly. Key among those, and this is very sort of normal for lots of companies, but it's not necessarily the way that every department does business in state government, which is we had to have Google Analytics. We had to have digital analytics to understand how folks were interacting with COVID-19.ca.gov, whether or not they were able to sign up to get the vaccine, to measure whether or not they were dropping off in that process, in that funnel, whether or not they would fully convert into getting an appointment. And thankfully, our partners at CDT already had a really robust system set up for statewide Google Analytics, and we were able to capitalize on that. But again, those kinds of measurement, data measurement, tools and processes happened at that time in a bubble, really. It happened for one website. It happened to be the most viewed website in the entire state of California for good reason and for some time. But it happened with that one website, and it happened with this one set of team. It was a collaborative team between CDT, CDPH, ODI, and several others. But as the intensity of the pandemic waned, so too did sort of that concentrated intensity on we have to know. A big issue with and I'm sure many of you recall this, a big issue of the Get Out the Vaccine campaign was an inequitable distribution of the vaccine. And we had to figure out why. We could guess, but we had to figure out, was it because of a lack of trust? Was it because of disinformation? Was it because of cultural differences? And we launched a huge research campaign in order to figure out where the most likely communities were located who were not vaccinated but willing. And we were able to use that information to effectively deploy resources into those communities. And so that was a very exciting and fulfilling project, but really that was the last time that we've been involved, at least personally or at ODI, in something that was sort of full circle in terms of data measurement, responding immediately, and getting services delivered where they needed to go.
Yeah. Adam brought up the issue of equity and how that's kind of key at CalHHS. And in the time that I was in the governor's office, that was a key for the governor as well. And Amy hit that as well, that equity is one of those key tenets of this governor, and making sure that that's kept in mind as we're delivering services and as we're figuring out the effectiveness of government and programs. What role has ODI played in that, and what role do you see it for ODI in that?
So, we talk about human-centered design and user research as key principles and best practices. At the core of that is equity. And the only way that we can equitably deliver services is to talk to everyone, to meet them where they are, understand what they need, and then address those needs based upon that data. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing right now based upon the governor's executive order on equity. And one thing that ODI is doing in response to that EO is implementing a plain language standard. And there are plain language standards currently in statute in the state of California. There's the Plain Writing Act of 2010 under the Obama administration. But none of those statutes actually include any bar to set, anything to measure success by. We know how to measure success with plain language. It's by reading level. So with that standard, we're introducing or asking state departments to meet a minimum of an 8th grade reading level with the materials that they produce for the public. And so that is an example of, and actually the statistic is really shocking, that drives a lot of this action is, I believe it's 53% of Californians read at a 6th grade reading level or below. And so if we're going to effectively serve all Californians, if it's going to be a California for all, we have to recognize that fact and take action in order to deliver services more equitably.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about the standards? This brings up the larger question of the standards that have been developed both during the alpha for CA.gov, the implementation of COVID-19, that's CA.gov, and then in response to the equity EO, the partnership between CDT and ODI in that regard. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, and again, COVID-19.ca.gov was really a catalyst for this. What came out of that work was a continued partnership on now what's known as the California State Design System. It's the first design system for the state of California. And a design system goes beyond what a web template would be, right? A design system is just that. It's a system of principles, best practices, resources, toolkits that are all designed based on usability, accessibility, from the color palettes as it relates to color blindness, from the font size and the recommended font sizes for readability, along with those principles of plain language and user experience design. And so that's a very good example of how our work is proven out in practice to be a successful digital service, but then we need to take that one step further and create something sustainable in order to try and scale that effort and have it be reproducible.
Yeah. Great. As I talked about at the very beginning, one of the models for ODIs, USDS, 18F, various other digital services, what we've seen over time is that these sorts of entities have specialized skill sets in the staff there. And so, people bring problems to those entities, you do a project, and then it comes time to hand that project off. And there's this cliff effect that's generally in most of these projects where the entity that's supposed to take it on, you certainly you don't have enough staff to continue to do this and then continue to scale out to other entities and other projects. So at some point there has to be that handoff. How are you working to make those handoffs more successful, and what sorts of things need to be done to make those handoffs more successful?
It's the pain there is real because ODI is quite small. I mean, even at total capacity, including our entire operations staff, we would have about a 65-person head count. And as we all know here, the California state government is enormous. And so there's no way that ODI or even CDT could ever be that capacity. We have to create that capacity with our partners. And so there are a few ways of going about that. One key way is training. And so we have to recognize that innovation, the word innovation you can start to lose track of what the heck that means. It can mean anything to anybody at any given time, right? And so I think what's really important for us at ODI is to understand that innovation is a skill set. It's a teachable skill set, right? And so to that end, we are launching Cal Academy at ODI, which is going to bring the ability to learn these skills, the skills that are required to innovate, such as writing in plain language, which is the first course that we're going to offer through CalLearns, I think, in January. Very excited about that.
And by the way, stunning that that's, there has to be a course on plain language. But having been in government for so long, I recognize the need for that, and very happy that that's one of the first things that ODI is going to tackle.
It's a skill. It is a skill that one has to learn. And especially in this community, which I'm so proud to now be a part of after several years, we get into our own language and our own way of speaking, and understanding what we're delivering and designing, but not necessarily facilitating that understanding for others.
It's interesting as you talk about the community, and it's an area that I've been happy to also be a part of. One of the developments that I've seen, this has been, we're just over 10 years since USDS started doing this, and so we're kind of in that space where there's a big transition going on, and hopefully a look back on what's working, what's not working. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is that so much talk now is starting to shift into the broader perspective of what this means. And so that's Jen Pahlka, who is one of the people that started in this whole area, has a book out, Recoding America. I'm not as excited about it from the technology perspective as all of the talk around it as a policy book, and how government should be operating, and about delivery. And I think taking the concepts that we all have been really living for, some of us the last decade, and taking that into that broader perspective of how does government run? How do you deliver services, and why does this matter? Because so often what we end up in is these situations where you start talking about digital services for the sake of digital services, or you start talking about innovation, and how many different entities now have the tagline innovation in them, or you start talking about data, and you're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, without really thinking through why is it that we're doing these things. And so I'm excited about where we are at this point in time, because that conversation is shifting, and it's really starting to talk about what these approaches mean for delivering services. And so what role do you see? I'm really happy, and I want to explore a little bit more about Cal Academy, because I think that that's a really key point, and something that's very different for ODI compared to, I think, just about any other digital service team that's out there, which has a delivery aspect without really talking about delivery, but not that educational mandate and that ODI has.
Sure. Sure. I think that you raise a couple of really interesting points there. One of those about Cal Academy and behind part of what's behind the name change of ODI, Office of Digital Services, now the Office of Digital Innovation, now the Office of Data and Innovation, is just really this recognition that the innovation is going to come from people, and that technology is a tool that will help us to enable that. But really, it's going to be about the people and the process that's going to bring about that change. And the good thing about that, or the challenge there, is that you can't just buy that.
Right.
So we have to live it, and we have to train our teams. And the same is true, not just broadly speaking for human-centered design practices and best practices, but it's also a core component of the governor's executive order on GenAI, and recognizing that this new tool, this new opportunity, in order to use it safely, effectively, is going to require training of our workforce, of our state workforce. And so, that's another huge opportunity as it relates to generative AI, is sort of this inflection point, this inflection moment, where we know that it's a complete paradigm shift, and it's not quite as dramatic, thankfully, or hopefully not as dangerous as COVID-19, But it is almost equally as galvanizing. I mean, we're all in these rooms talking about this right now, right? Thankfully. I wish that, and perhaps this had happened, but having forums and symposiums like this when social media was created would have gone, I think, a very long way in terms of better protecting our communities. And so the fact that we're doing this now and being as proactive as we can to train our workforce to be able to use the technology, I think is very, very powerful.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point there that we've been talking about capacity, and I think that we certainly haven't mastered what capacity is going to look like in this space, but we have various approaches, and I think we've gotten fairly good at understanding how to bring people into government at the kind of entry level, mid level. Certainly, we need to figure out the scalability there. And that's one way to kind of deal with the capacity issue that we have. The other is the Cal Academy, that sort of an approach where there's a training component to really train up the staff that we have there already. But one of the other components that we need in order to really scale this, and really for us to think of this as in the terms of policy and in how government actually operates, is really leadership. And not leadership in a digital service environment, but leadership more broadly across government. What role do you see for ODI in that sort of an approach, and that the development of leadership and helping to make that a priority?
I think that the basic operating model that we see is, which I think I've already described to a certain extent, is sort of working on a project basis with the partner department, proving value, and then working on implementation and sustainability, building some capacity so it can go on. As it relates to the leadership component, there has to be more of a, I don't know if culture change is the right word, but there has to be, we have to bring folks on board with the value proposition writ large for what it means to do business in this way. And so I think that there's a big awareness issue that hopefully some training will also be effective for our California state leadership. I think we also need to, and this is something that ODI is focused on, we need to create the tools and the ability for our business leaders to benefit from these kinds of techniques. One of the things that I've noticed from some time that I spent prior to joining state government and private sector was we don't have any marketing departments here. And that makes sense because we're not exactly selling anything. But in my experience, the marketing department between the business and the technology units is really the brain. It is the brain of what our customer needs, and it finds that out, and it sends that message back to the business leadership and gives them that data to be able to make data-driven decisions in improving their products. And so I think that we need to do a better job at creating a kind of business intelligence and marketing capacity within the state to serve our business leaders so they're able to actually take on that role and see its value. And I'll just say finally as well that I'm very optimistic about generative AI helping with that.
In what way?
So I think that if we look at the way that GenAI is being used right now, a lot of it has to do, there's a big co-pilot component of really helping folks with a certain skill set amp those skills up. And it also, the generative component of the technology enables a kind of marketing capacity, a kind of marketing role that doesn't otherwise exist in state government. And so I'm excited about using that generative component as well as the co-pilot ability to help folks, let's say in the public affairs branch, who don't know how to write SQL, but know the right questions to ask about the customer and can use a natural language prompt to get the data required to give to our business leaders so they can make better decisions. So there's a lot of new capabilities within this technology that will help close that capacity gap.
As you're talking about that, and I like the idea of kind of this transitional moment and the focus that's given. As we think through kind of that leadership development, there are different pathways that you can imagine for getting senior level leaders who value and understand these approaches to delivery. And so you can see the one where it's kind of people move up through government naturally as they go up. It tends to be a siloed approach, and so you're going to see a lot of those in the kind of the CIO space, as you see people coming up through the digital service programs and they kind of move up. That transition over into the policy realm and the other functions is a little bit more difficult and requires some training and some mentoring in that space. But you can imagine that it's kind of a slow way of government transformation, but it's a way. And you can see others where you bring people in from outside state government and put them in spaces where they have authority and where they can influence how government operates. So you're a good example of that. We'll talk to Steve Gordon later on today, who's another person that's in that mold of being able to come in and adapt to a governmental space, but bring in those ideas and those approaches and challenge the way that the government operates. And then the other requires a kind of an external exogenous type of a shock where a governor or a governor-elect or a president is saying, this is a priority for me. We're going to rethink how government operates and how it delivers. And perhaps GenAI is one of those moments where it allows governors and presidents to really think through, and I think we're seeing evidence of it in the EOs that are coming out, that they're starting to think through, how can you take this moment and really rethink how government operates, and how can it be a positive force for how we're going to operate? And may even, I'm not going to say that you're ever going to see where you hire a Secretary of Health and Human Services just for their delivery capacity in and of itself. There's going to be other factors that come in as well, but certainly one of the top things that you could be asking for your cabinets, how are you going to deliver services? How are you going to actually translate the ideas that you have into changes for people? And so and I know that you were talking about Cal Academy, and that kind of triggered for me this idea, because I know that Cal Academy also has that authority at the senior-most levels of providing that awareness, that training to provide an awareness. It's not that I'd expect that you're going to have secretaries that are out there journey mapping how their processes work or those sorts of things, but an expectation that they have staff that do and can then talk to them about how that operates. Does that make any sense to you, and what role would you see for ODI in that?
Absolutely, and that role, is really collaborative, especially working with Secretary Tong and the whole team at the Government Operations Agency, and then with the Office of Professional Development at CDT. A core aspect that we're thinking of, our head of Cal Academy, along with the Deputy Secretary for Workforce Development at GovOps, is that we're not just training the tacticians. That's very important when it comes to generative AI specifically. But this has also opened up a realization and a moment where we also have to have an executive level training that is not necessarily training folks on how to effectively write a prompt or any of the other skills that are required to use the technology, but is training them in terms of a sense of awareness of what the possibilities are and how they could potentially use that tool to improve the way they deliver services and run their business. And so that's just one example of how generative AI has opened up the opportunity and the awareness that there are and there needs to be varying tracks of training again, because these aren't just technology issues, these are business problems, and these are people issues. And so they won't be solved by simply through a technical training. And so it has to be that holistic approach. I'll also add too that I think that you mentioned, the one scenario you mentioned about a governor coming in and setting up sort of the conditions of possibility for that kind of change. I think that the executive orders that the governor has released over the past year, including GenAI, but also on equity, as well as a lesser known one, but I know it very well, as I know the secretary and a few others do, is the executive order on infrastructure. And what those orders do, to one way or another, is force your hand in having to measure your success. Mm-hmm. And so wrapped up in the equity order, we have new ways of measuring demographics, a mandate to not only measure certain races and ethnicities, but how do we measure sexual orientation and other categories of identity. And likewise with infrastructure, how do we measure those dollars in and out and what impact they're having on communities? And so in those executive orders is really tied up this approach to doing business differently.
Yeah. We're going to be wrapping up here. So what do you see as next?
Is Adam?
No, he'll yank us pretty soon.
Okay.
So what's next? What do you see on the horizon for ODI? What do you see as kind of the things that need to be put in place? You talked a bit about a marketing function, which I know you aren't saying marketing in the private sector.
The name for that, right?
But what because I do think that as we were going through the pandemic, we were in that moment where we were forced to really understand what was happening with people. Mm-hmm. And we had limited time and limited resources, and they needed to be applied very quickly and in the right places. And that was, that also forced us to push forward what were our values, mm-hmm. And then implement based on those values. And so what do you see, how can California and other places have that sort of a function in a sustainable manner? And what does that look like?
These principles and ways of doing business are not a nice to have, that they are the way we should be doing our day job, right? And I don't think that anybody disagrees with that. I think that it has to do with enablement, everything we've been talking about today, enablement, capacity, the right tools, the right training.
Priority.
And setting the priority, absolutely. And so, and I think I think that goes both ways. I think that the priority will get set once the value is proven. And so there's a sort of chicken and egg as it relates to that, but we have to keep showing that value and demonstrating that value. In terms of where we go next, I really want to see more community being built. And we have an AI community of practice that we've launched with the generative AI executive order coming out. ODI has an innovation community of practice that we're really excited about in terms of bringing frontline workers, frontline staff in to share what they're seeing on the ground and share some of that feedback that they're hearing from residents. And I think that we need a community of practice for state business leaders that is focused on innovation, to keep this conversation going, to continue to find where the resources are, to support one another, and continue to make it as sustainable and scalable as possible.
And a continued focus on people.
Absolutely.
I think that was one of the major things we've seen is a shifting and away from some of those program focuses into a person-centered focus, which your organization is right at the front of leading, because how do you know what people need? You need to have ways and tools and methods for figuring that out, and that's, I think, where ODI is uniquely positioned, both in the skill sets that it has in the staff, and then also in the training functions that you're in the process of bringing up. So it's been an amazing journey, a lot done in a relatively short period of time. And thank you for everything that you're doing for the state. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.